Here to talk about hearing impaired diving is Jessica and Jeremy Bewer.
My name is Jeremy and this is my wife Jessica, and I am a PADI scuba instructor that has had the fortunate experience of working with the developmentally disabled and hearing impaired. And we're here to talk about our scuba diving experiences. Jessica is hearing impaired, and we've been diving together for 6 years now?
Roughly
6 years. And we've had some pretty interesting experiences. One of the things that made me so excited about working with Jessica was that for the first time while scuba diving, it was so easy to communicate with somebody. Instead of pulling out a slate and writing down, you know, look at the blue fish, or look at the, you know, look over there. I could easily, very simply, by just using my hands, say, you know, look at the blue fish. And she would respond pretty receptively and then sign back, but what about that? You know, and point out things to me. So it was pretty amazing to be able to communicate like that with someone so easily, and it actually made everybody in our dive trip very, very jealous. When we had surfaced, everybody wanted to learn how to sign. And we already have a very basic understanding of it as divers. You know, simple things like okay, you know, obviously. But there was other things that I enjoyed working with her and diving with her. But that was probably one of the best things that I've experienced with her. How about you?
Hi, I'm Jessica. One of the reasons that I'm here today is to talk a little bit about what it's like to be hearing impaired or deaf and to also be a diver. I've been diving with my husband Jeremy for roughly 6 years, and I'm lucky in that not everyone has the opportunity to dive or learn to dive with their husband, who's also a dive master and can give me the personal attention that I needed. So I can't say that my experience is going to be the norm for everyone, but it might give you a good idea of some of the challenges that I face and some of the unique things that you might run into if you dive with someone that's hearing impaired. First, I wasn't born deaf, but I gradually lost my hearing over the course of about 15 years. Started off as a mild impairment, which didn't greatly impact my abilities, and then by the time I started learning to dive, it was severe to profound, which means that things basically had to be at the volume of a Harley Davidson being revved or a lawnmower or something before I could even hear that. So obviously that presents some interesting challenges when it comes to things like learning in a classroom environment or catching what the dive master is saying during a briefing or whatever. I never really thought of myself as too different as far as learning to dive. I was like, well, you know, gosh, it's just that people need to talk with me a little bit more, or they have to be patient when I repeat myself. But I didn't always consider the impact it had on other people, which is, I guess I can't always consider all of those issues. I've never really thought of myself as different in terms of, you know, my deafness has this great impact on my ability to dive or how good of a diver I have the potential to be. I've never really thought that my hearing loss or being deaf really had much of an impact on my ability to be an effective diver or my ability to learn how to dive. I did not, though, think about how my hearing loss impacts the people that have to deal with me while I'm diving. And I think that presents some unique situations that maybe people don't always think about, because hearing loss is one of those hidden disabilities. It makes it very easy to not think about that.
As an instructor, one of the things that I found that was important to be paying attention to is during the dive briefings, making sure that she obviously is catching all of it. When we're on a dive boat, there's so much activity and so much stuff going on that it probably would be better when you're working with a hearing impaired person to potentially do that maybe beforehand, before you get on the boat, one-on-one, you know, because of all the distractions again and everything that happen on that boat.
Well, actually, a better way to do it might just be to ask the person what kind of accommodations they want or would be most effective for them. The thing about working with individuals who have hearing loss or deaf is many of us are really, really, really proud. We don't want to put people out, but at the same time, we don't want to have to rely on someone else for every single thing. I personally would rather have someone say, what can I do to make this easier for you, instead of assuming that I need you to talk louder at me or repeat it over and over. Most of the time, people are very upfront about what would be most effective for them. Some things, if they don't have suggestions as far as what would make it more effective for them, you might want to point out that the dive boat is loud. People are rushing to get all their gear on. An individual who's hearing impaired or deaf would either have to stop putting their gear together to listen to a dive briefing, which many people don't have to do, which runs the embarrassment of making them late and holding up the rest of the people for getting into the water and all these other issues. So if they don't have ideas on what might be easier for them, you might recommend that you have the dive briefing before you get on the boat, when things are quiet. You can take your time to repeat things if they're not catching what you're saying. You could use paper, draw landmarks. You can write down important information such as the depth you're diving to, how long you'll be down, things you might see there. And combination of lip reading or maybe someone signing to them and what's written is going to give them more information than just trying to lip read alone.
One of the important things that I found when working with the hearing impaired, as it kind of talks about in the manual, is you need to make sure that you have the attention of the person that you're speaking to, and make sure that you are looking at that person directly.
That person's looking
and
at
that person, that helps too. It helps on both ways. But simple things that we do, that people that are hearing do, that are subconscious, could be something as simple as putting your hand over your mouth like this. At this point, that person can't lip read you. Chewing gum, chewing on a pencil while talking. These are all bad habits that people that are hearing impaired have and do. And when you're working, people that are hearing have and do. And when you're working with someone who is hearing impaired, those distractions will make or break the conversation. You know, again, you don't want to be condescending when you're talking to a person. I've seen things before happening when, you know, they find out my wife is deaf, and they'll just talk louder, you know, and that doesn't necessarily help, or they'll over-enunciate their words, which that really screws them up if they're trying to lip read. And of course, you know, if they're hearing impaired or deaf and it's very loud, you don't want to try and talk to them like you would somebody else who is hearing and whisper in their ear or talk louder in their ear. We've seen that a couple times too.
And it does happen a lot. It does happen a lot. Some of the most basic things that you want to keep in mind when you're communicating with someone that's hearing impaired or deaf is gain their attention. Make sure they're looking at you before you start talking. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. For myself, my husband stomps on the floor and I can feel that 3 rooms away. That can be offensive to some people, so you want to use that as a last resort. If you're inside, you can flick lights sometimes if you can't gain their attention any other way. Many deaf people, the most common, what's accepted with everyone, is a simple wave like this, and that is typical deaf attention gainer. For myself, I have no problem if someone just comes up and puts their hand on my shoulder, you know, hey, and I'll look over and they can start talking. That to me is a very common thing.
And one of the, we're talking about a very important thing. Now, let's bring it underwater. Typically, when we're diving underwater, we'll have a tank banger or something like that. And a person who is deaf or hearing impaired is not obviously going to be able to hear that. They need something that has that vibrates. And there's really nothing on the market right now currently that suffices. We've tried the underwater, alerts, and none of those seem to have worked. So you basically need to be a very attentive buddy as well. You need to be a good buddy. You know, don't swim too far away, because now if you're 10 feet away from your buddy and you see something cool, or she needs you or he needs you, you're that much farther away. Now, if you know sign language, it's easy to communicate. But again, if they're looking at you, but yeah, if they're not looking at you, then you've got a whole other situation on your hand. The only way to get their attention again is to swim up to them and tap them and let them know that you need their attention. So what I found is I consider myself a pretty good buddy, but I always stay pretty close to Jessica. When we dive, we both stay pretty close to each other, just so that, again, she sees something, she can just turn around and get my attention, or if I see something, I can turn around and get her attention, you know, just by simply touching her. One of the other things I found is if you do know sign language and you're underwater and you're communicating with your buddy, hopefully not a lot of you are going to be diving in really cold water. If you are, having gloves on really kind of interfere with the signs that you would be trying to communicate. I've used several different gloves to try and see which ones have the agility, and most of them are just hard enough to just make a simple OK signal, let alone trying to sign a full sentence. So I've encountered that, and that sometimes is difficult, but as an instructor, you need to be prepared for that. Whether you use thinner gloves or try to stay away from gloves at all, even if you're diving in a tropical area, again, that seems to interfere with that.
Or you can go back to using slates work well. We tend to not use slates because we both use sign, and it's just faster to use sign language, but slates work great for anyone, you know what I mean? And it's not patronizing, even hearing people use slates underwater. One of the things you might run into with individuals that are hearing impaired or deaf is that you have to understand that many of us spent many years asking people to repeat themselves over and over and over. And oftentimes we deal with people that are not very patient. So if we get the slightest hint of someone not being patient with us or becoming a little bit frustrated about repeating, or even if maybe we've had that happen earlier in the day and we're tired of that, occasionally, and actually I shouldn't say occasionally, quite a bit, people will just smile and go like this and try and play it off like they've understood you. Now that can be a real problem when you're teaching someone or you're giving safety guidelines or depth times or whatever. So what might be a good idea is from the beginning with individuals that have a hearing loss, set the stage for a potential issue like that by saying something to the effect of, I want to make sure that you're safe, that you're understanding everything. I know it's hard to lip read, and I want to be sure that you got it right. So I might ask you to repeat stuff back to me to make sure that you understood it. If you start that process early rather than when you have an issue, then it's less likely to be perceived as patronizing. It's less embarrassing for the individual that you're calling on, playing that game of, shaking their head when they don't really understand you. It also will help you assess their comprehension because with lip reading, I know it says some in your instructor's manual about only 1/3 of English sounds, not words, sounds are readable on the lips, and the other 70-odd% either look like something else on the lips or it takes place in the throat. What that results in is you may say something to them and they may hear something totally different. They may understand something totally different, but it still makes sense. You know what I mean? So if you ask them to repeat, you may catch them on those things before it becomes a problem. Ascending and descending. Can't hear the boats. Sometimes we might feel the vibrations.
Brilliant.
I
wanted to talk about that.
Although we teach people, when you're going up, you have your head above and you turn in circles. The reality is a lot of people don't do that, hearing or not, you know what I mean? The other thing was, you talked about the gaining attention, but that's also above and below water.
Right.
If someone wears a hearing aid, they can't wear that in the water. What else? Right. Safety issues.
Well, obviously
we kind of talked about the dive briefing part, so I don't know if we should re-mention that.
No.
But
obviously not being able to call 911 readily. I mean, they're able to call 911, but depending on the person's level of deafness, their voice may not be.
Like me, where I just keep saying, "Hi, this is Jessica. I'm stuck," and I don't know if anyone's there, so I just keep repeating it. Do you know what I mean? I guess we could re-mention the attention.
You've felt it before, because I remember we were on a dive, and I think we were in, I think it was Little Cayman, and I remember we were on a dive and we were ascending, and we actually weren't ascending. We weren't finishing the dive, but we were just kind of coming up from a deeper depth. And you felt the vibration of
I couldn't tell where it was.
Right. Of course. Well, yeah. Neither can we. We can't tell where it is either because of the sound travels so much faster in the water. But you were able to you kind of looked at me and you're like, "What's that?" Oh, that's a boat. And I was like, "Oh, that's cool. She can hear that or feel that."
Right.
It was pretty neat
but
to be able.
But if it was a small boat, I don't know if I would.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know.
but that's something that we really should be paying attention
I
to.
think people should just assume that they can't hear. It's probably safer because you don't know.
Right.
You know what I mean?
There's so many things that, as a hearing person, we're going to probably take for granted, and that we can't. We have to be on our toes. And again, pretty much any HSA instructor it probably already knows this and is aware that that you know, you can't take things for granted because you're working with people that don't have the, I guess, luxuries of what we have, being able to hear or whatnot.
Because you're working with people that all have varying degrees of disability, and not being able to experience it yourself, you don't know what they're going to be able to hear and what they're not going to be able to hear.
Did you want to talk about the different levels of hearing impairment? You know, and I mean, considering you're hearing impaired, you were not born deaf, and there are people out there that are born deaf and have.
Right. I guess I could talk a little bit about the cultural deafness, about someone that, see, the thing that's hard about that is, like, when you're dealing with decibel levels, if you're talking about, like, the average person hears up, you know, the softest sound they hear is 20 decibels, you know, and the voice is, say, 30 decibels. A rock concert is 120 decibels. A jet airplane is 130. Well, I was at 120 and I still used a hearing aid and I was still able to hear things. So you can't go in absolutes necessarily because of what decibel level they're at. You have to consider what kind of adaptive equipment they use, what kind of hearing loss they have. And I personally would never assume anything related to a severity level or a decibel level. I would just communicate with the person and see what kind of issues I ran into, or ask them, how much are you really hearing? How much are you lip reading? You know, I think that for myself, I've never been offended if people ask me questions about my deafness. You know what I mean? I look at that in terms of they're asking because they care, because they want to be able to communicate with me. And that was always a huge thing with me before I got the cochlear implant, was if people didn't make an effort with me, then, you know, it's not worth my time. If I hadn't found someone that had patience with me, that took the time to repeat stuff, then I probably never would have went through scuba, and I probably wouldn't have continued with that. One of my biggest things, and I don't know what it's like for other people who are deaf or hearing impaired or whatever, but one of the biggest things for me is being isolated socially. You know, people have limited patience. You'll find people that are great without even thinking about it, and other people that try, but, you know, have a harder time with it, and some that really just don't care. And it's obvious for me within 5 minutes of talking to someone what their attitude is. One of the hardest things for me as someone that's hearing impaired or deaf, even, you know, when I had a mild loss, would be people talking around me, whether that's in a social situation or asking a question in class, and people responding, you know, repeating it, and me still not understanding. Then eventually they got tired of it and said, "Oh, just forget it, it doesn't matter." Well, it does matter to me. If it wasn't important, then you wouldn't have said it in the first place, you know what I mean? It's important for me to be involved, and it's important for my safety in scuba. So part of the scuba experience, too, is all that social that surrounds it, and if you aren't willing to have the patience to work with someone in that, then you should probably work with a different group, because to deprive them of that socialness robs kind of half the experience of scuba diving, which is that culture and that team. I can't even think of the right phrase right now.
One of the things that you said that kind of I just heard recently is communicate with the person, not the disability. And I think that's very important. You know, you want to make sure that you are talking to that person, and you know what she was saying. You know, it was a very, very good point, and that we need to be focusing more on that person than on what level of disability they are, and make sure that they understand, you know, everything, from the tiniest detail on up.
Right. I can't think of a lot of technology that would be useful in diving, in making diving more accessible for someone with a hearing loss. They don't have, waterproof hearing aids. Just not, we're not at that level. I wish it would have saved me a lot of money when I got caught in the rain with my hearing aids. You know what I mean? So we don't have waterproof hearing aids. I guess if someone had like a full head helmet thing with speakers in it or whatever, then that might be one way. But how many people really use something like that? How functional is that? You know what I mean? I guess I don't see, like, I mean, being underwater, how much are you hearing anyway? I mean, you hear some sounds, but it's not like you hear his voice or anything, so that part's really not different, other than I can probably talk to him better.
Well, right, and I remember...
you can talk to your buddy.
I remember that was one of the things that you loved so much, because it evened the playing field for you.
Actually,
you know?
I was at an easier level. As far as the playing field, I surpassed everyone.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a very unique experience. It's very freeing to have everyone in the same position that I deal with all day long, 365 days a year.
And it's great to be able to communicate with you underwater.
If you're interested in learning more about sign, there's several different ways you can go about that. If you're in the Chicago area, actually all around Illinois, you can do it. Community colleges many times will offer at least 1 or 2 sign classes. Some areas have a larger deaf community, or you might have deaf schools, or schools that have special programs for the deaf. And those would be good places to ask about sign classes. They may offer them, or they may be able to guide you to a place that teaches sign. If you don't have classes nearby, you can also do a search on the web. If you type in sign language and do a search on Google or any of the major search engines, you can find websites that provide sign on, like, pictures of sign. And there's also some that show the sign in videotape type format, so you can see it all the way through. Best Buy, I'm not trying to hype a store here, but I know I've seen them at Best Buy. They have an American Sign Language dictionary that shows things in video form. And although it's a little quirky, it shows, if you type in a sentence, it will show you all the signs you need to do that sentence. Now, some of the signs you might not see deaf people using, but it will give you a good start. You can also, if you're on a trip with a deaf person, I think that it's kind of a bonding thing to ask them, well, you know, how would you sign this or how would you sign that? And most people wouldn't be offended by something like that. They would look at it in terms of you're approaching this because you want to communicate with them and you want to learn more.
There's also something out there right now called C-Signs, which is pretty well set up, that has actually flashcards for the signs and pictures. And video, right? And it's great because with the pictures you can train several different levels of people, whether several different levels of disability or children, because you're again able to look at the pictures and and see what the signs are, whether it's whether this that's moray eel, and it actually has a nice little picture of a moray eel, things like that. But C-Signs is a pretty valuable resource for people that want to learn a lot more scuba signs, in particular.
With C-Sign, though, you need to be aware that some of the signs that are in there, they're great. But in the deaf community, we might fingerspell that. C-Signs has worked with organizations to try and standardize signs for areas that the deaf community might fingerspell. The reason they do that is because of the issues you run into with scuba, whereas like if you're wearing gloves, you can't necessarily read fingerspelling. So you need something that's visible. They've also paired up with organizations because they don't want to mistakenly change a sign that's normal or standard in scuba and different in the deaf community, because that would present safety issues if scuba divers and then deaf scuba divers were signing 2 different things.
One thing that I want to talk about was in the classroom. As an instructor, we'll use the chalkboard or whatever behind us a lot of times to draw things or whatnot. And again, it's taking things for granted that we'll turn our backs and start writing on the wall. Now the person who's sitting right in front of you can't hear a darn word you're saying. So you always have to be very cautious, and I've done it to her where I'd turn I'm sorry honey, and I'd have to actually catch myself and turn around and continue doing what I'm doing so that she can lip read me, or at least try and focus in on what I'm saying. Most of the videos out there aren't closed captioned either. So if you want to try and give your student, here, just watch these videos, well, they're going to be very frustrated when they get home and pop those videos in and they're not captioned.
Accessible.
Yeah, not accessible. So that's something that can very easily frustrate your student. I know it frustrates the heck out of me when I come home and want to watch a movie with her. And, you know, especially in today's world, that there's a movie out there that's not captioned. I usually don't watch them. I usually throw them. That's how frustrated I get, and I'm hearing. So I can't imagine what someone who wasn't feels like.
Well, it might present some safety risks if you relied on me being able to catch everything in a video, you know.
Of course. What did we do for you? Did we watch those videos together and I signed with you on those videos? I think that's, I'm trying to remember.
Well, you know, we did things in a lot of different ways. I have very good reading skills. Some people may not if they were born deaf, if they had deaf family members, and they would use American Sign Language. The sentence structure can be funky, so they might not be able to read as well. But I do read well, so everything I was able to read, I was able to comprehend. I know there were some things that the video overlapped the book, so we didn't necessarily spend a whole lot of time on those sections. But he very much helped me through the parts of the videos that didn't overlap with the book.
And it's when you go on trips, you know, it's going to be, you're not going to be able to find an interpreter in Dominica, most likely.
Unless you bring one with you,
right, of course. And also, you may find that there are differences in sign language in different areas. American Sign Language, ASL, is probably the most common sign language, but there's also signed English, and we've found that there's also almost dialects throughout the United States.
Well, some regional differences, not all signs different, but like a few keywords, you'll find differences regionally.
Right. So that's something to be aware of, that they've got their own little dialects as well.
But what you should know is that people who are hearing impaired or deaf, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you can sign with them fluently or whether you can sign at all. What I found is most important for me is people simply making that effort. I will do all that I can to communicate with you, whether that's writing or lip reading or signing or reading your finger spelling, as slow as it might be. But I'm so thrilled that someone will take that time to want to communicate with me and want to make sure that I understand them.